Hi again, so I'm Kiana and I'm with the Emerald Coast Science Center, and so for today's video we're going to be doing something a little different than we did with our last one. If you watched the last video I did, we talked about some seashells and I told you that I really love the ocean, and so we're going to kind of stay on that theme and we're going to be doing some experimentations with water. So the main topic of our conversation today is going to be basically comparing and contrasting fresh water to salt water. So like I said, I really like the ocean, and we know that in the ocean, the water that comes from the ocean is a little different than the water that we drink. So we know in the ocean we've got some salt water and the water we drink is fresh water. So what we're going to be doing today is we're going to be kind of looking at the different properties and the different characteristics of those two different kinds of water. So first thing I'm doing for my experiment here is I have my two samples. These are empty right now, I'm about to fill them up, but we have to make sure that when we're doing our experimentation, labeling is super important. So we've got our two samples, our two containers labeled for our samples so we don't mix them up. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to fill sample A with fresh water. And I'm going to do the same thing with sample B. And so I'm going to be adding salt to sample B, and that way everything else about the water samples is the same, and the only thing that we're changing is the salt content. And so I've already got some salt measured out for myself here. Usually this is a experiment that we do offer as an activity you can do at the center, usually with a field trip, or a school group will book something like this. But this is something that we do at the center that is pretty interesting and fun to do. So I added in my salt there, and I'm going to be mixing this around. So we know that those two different kinds of salt water samples there are going to have some differences, but the ones that we're going to be looking at today, we're going to be testing to see if their pH changes. We're going to be testing if the temperature changes. We're also going to see how to test for salinity, and the other characteristic that we're going to be looking at the difference of is the density, and see how that changes when we add salt to that water. So I'm just mixing this around really well so that that salt will dissolve in this water sample here. So like I said, we've got a couple things we're going to test for, but the way that we are going to be kind of defining the difference between salt and fresh water is by its salinity. So salinity just refers to the amount of salt dissolved into the sample. So that salt water would have a higher salinity than fresh water would have. So fresh water is usually going to be something that would contain 0 to 1 parts per thousand, and salt water in the ocean would usually contain around the 30s range of salt. So they would be anywhere from 30 to 39 parts per thousand. We also have what is known as brackish water, which we have in most of our bays around here. So that's going to be kind of between the two. So brackish is a little bit salty, a little bit fresh. So that's going to kind of fill that range in between the 0s to the 30s. And then past salt water, we have what is known as brine. So when we get really, really salty water, we can have brine, and that's usually going to be 60 to 80 parts per thousand in that sample. So one of the things that we are going to use to test the salinity of a water sample is this right here. So this is what is known as a refractometer. So as you can see, it's got a little bit of a plastic covering here, and then this is its window or its opening that's going to let light through, and then this is its eyepiece here. So you're going to be looking right through that eyepiece to look at the results of your sample, right? So the way that this works is, like I said, it's called a refractometer because it measures the amount of light refraction that takes place as light travels through your sample. So salty water is going to bend light differently than fresh water would. So that can kind of be a way that we can test how salty something is by how the light responds to being passed through the sample. So the way that you would use this is you would take just a couple drops of your water sample and you put it right there on this little blue window, and you would place the flap back down, and then you can look right into your sample here, and what it's going to look like on the inside is like this right here. So it's going to have a reading just like that, and then about halfway or wherever your sample measured, it's going to have a line, and it's going to be half blue and half white, and that's going to be your reading. So for our freshwater sample, it's going to be really low down here. So right here you would have it half blue and half white, down by the 100s, but for our saltwater sample, it's going to be up around this area. So you can do that to test the salinity of your water based on its ability to refract light through the sample. So we tested a freshwater sample, and if we wanted to test the saltwater sample, we can do the same thing. What we're going to do is just take a couple drops of our water, put it right there on the window, replace your eye flap, and then look right through. And it's going to be, like I said, in the 30s range. So now that we have a saltwater sample and a freshwater sample, we can kind of look at some of the other characteristics that changed when we added that salt in. So one of the things we test for as well, this is kind of just for our fun and our own learning here, because this isn't really going to change too much, but we can look at the temperature of our sample. So we can see if maybe adding that salt to our sample changed the temperature of the water. So I've got my little thermometer here, and we're going to test our water sample. So for our freshwater sample here, we've got this water reading at 74.8 degrees Fahrenheit. And we're going to give it a second. We can test our next water sample. All right, and this one's getting to be 74.2, so about the same. So our waters don't really change temperature when we add the salt to it, but we do know is that adding salt to water actually changes its freezing point. So that's something that we use a lot up north. So when we see people who need to spread ice onto roads to make them, salt onto roads to make them less icy, what that's doing is actually lowering the freezing point of that water so that the water isn't frozen ice. It's actually going to, the ice will melt because that water can't freeze at that temperature. It has to be much, much colder in order for it to freeze. So then the ice on your roads melts. So we saw that it didn't change the temperature of our sample, but we can test the pH as well. So right here I have some pH strips. So the pH scale goes from 0 to 14. Right in the middle is neutral, so about 7 is neutral, and then the lower you go on the scale, the more acidic, and the higher on the scale, you're going to have more of a basic. So this is kind of what we're going to be looking at here. So it's going to be on this end, the more red colors. If our strip turns those red colors, it's going to be more of an acidic liquid that we're testing. And if it's more of these darker colors, it's going to be more basic of a sample. And then right in the middle there, it's going to be those yellows and green colors. So we're going to see if our pH changed when we added that salt. All right, so here's our freshwater sample. I'm going to let that sit for a second. And our saltwater sample. So like I said, we're looking to see if the pH changed at all between our two samples here. So we're going to let these develop. It's looking like we're already changing a little bit. I don't know how well you can pick that up on camera, but we have one turning a little bit more of a green color than the other. Let's see. Can get it to go a little darker. Right, so you see our two strips are kind of changing different colors here. So we did have a slight pH change when we did change the salt content of that water. So we had them both being really close to neutral, but with one turning a little more green than the other. So we did see a slight pH change between our salt and our fresh water. All right, so we saw that there are some characteristics that are different between our salt and our freshwater samples here. But why are some reasons that we might want to know the differences between the two? Why would we want to know if it's salty or not? So a big reason that we would want to know that is because there are different things that can survive in different salinities, right? So we know that there are freshwater fish and there are saltwater fish, and we know that they can't really switch between the two. So if it's designed to live in saltwater, it has to live in saltwater. If it's designed to live in freshwater, it has to live in freshwater. So there's a couple of reasons for that, but one of the big ones is that Our cells are capable of osmosis, so that means that water is able to transfer itself in and out of our cells because we have a semi-permeable membrane. So in those fish, they have different ways of maintaining a homeostasis or an isotonic solution for their cells. So their cells want to have the same amount of dissolved particles inside of them as outside of them. So if you're a freshwater fish, you'd want to live in an isotonic solution, so you'd want an equal amount of dissolved particles inside of your cell as you do outside of your cell. So since you live in freshwater, there's not as many dissolved particles because it doesn't have that salt, and so you'd only have a couple little particles dissolved in your water around your cell, and you'd have a couple particles inside of your cell. So it'd kind of be like this, where outside of your cell you've got some, and inside of your cell you've got some. So what your cells are going to want to do is they're going to want to let in a lot of water to help dilute the amount of particles inside of your cell to kind of make it even. So what that water is going to do is be flowing into your cells, and the exact opposite is going to happen if you live in really salty water. So the water inside of your cells is going to want to leave your cells to even out the saltiness of the surrounding area. So what these freshwater fish are going to do is when they go to the bathroom, they're going to go to the bathroom a lot, and it's going to be nice and diluted so that they can reduce the amount of water in their cells. And then what some saltwater animals are going to do is they're going to have to find ways to get rid of that excess salt. So what they do is there's some sea turtles that have really salty tears. So sea turtles will cry out some of their excess salt. And then there are also marine iguanas that are able to sneeze out salt. So those are the ones that they live on the rocks, but they dive down and they eat algae off of rocks underwater. And so they have that excess salt inside of their bodies, and they will sneeze out some of that to help keep everything nice and even. That's also the reason that we don't want to drink salt water to hydrate ourselves, because like I said, the water inside of your cells is going to actually want to leave to balance out all of the salt and that's around it, and then when you go to the bathroom, all that water is going to leave your body, and so you end up being more dehydrated than you were before you drank the salt water. So that's why we don't drink it. But yeah, so we know that it's really important to know the salinities of the water samples, because that kind of can determine what animals can live in that area, right? Alright, so another thing that changes when we change the salinity of our water is its density. So density refers to the amount of compactness of a sample. So if you have something with a lot of salt dissolved into it, it's going to be more dense or more compact. So as you can see, these samples are about even, but because we added all that extra salt, that has to kind of compact all of those water molecules closer together to make room for all of those salt particles as well. So these samples of salt water are going to be more dense than our freshwater. So if our freshwater sample is less dense than our saltwater sample, what do you think is easier to float in? So let's put in our little cubes here, and let's see if we can see a difference. Let me back up a little bit, I think we can see better. So as I drop these little colored cubes into our freshwater sample, you can see they kind of just sink right to the bottom. Let's see when we add them to our saltwater sample, what happens. Turn sideways, you can see those little cubes a little better. So when we add our cubes to our saltwater sample, they float a little bit better, don't they? So we've got these cubes floating right here on top. So the reason for this is because, like I said, our saltwater sample here is really dense. So if you want to think of it another way, you can kind of think of it like a pillow in its firmness. So with our salt water here, it's like a really firm pillow. So if you were to lay on your really firm pillow, your head would kind of just sit on top. But with our freshwater sample, since it's less dense, it doesn't have as much stuffing in its pillow. So then when you lay your head on it, you kind of sink down into it a little better. So more room for these little cubes to sink down to the bottom, whereas with our firm water or our dense water, these guys are going to sit nicely on top, except for my little green one. Alright, so with our more dense water here, another way that we test for salinity, since as you can see the density changes when we change salinity, is based on that density, right? So right here we have hydrometers. So these are also able to test salinity, but they do so based on the density change. So there's a little handle here, or a little arm here that can float on the water sample. So when you have water that is really dense, it floats up higher, and when you have water that is less dense, it's going to kind of sink down lower. So the more dense your sample, the more salty your sample, the more your little arm is going to float. So I'm going to try this out real quick. Alright, as you can see, my little arm floated right up to the top there with my saltwater sample. We're going to try the same thing with our fresh water here. Alright, and as you can see with my freshwater sample, the little arm there is going to stay towards the bottom. So our more dense sample floats, and our less dense sample allows that little arm to sink. We see a little bit of layering when we look at the ocean, and that layering can be the result of changes in density. It also can come from changes in temperature, but usually what we see is that the lower we go down in the ocean, the more dense, the more salty our water is. And that kind of makes sense because our heavier, thicker, firmer, more dense water is going to sink, whereas our fresher, less salty water is going to float. So we'll see a little bit of variation in the ocean when we look at different densities and stuff like that inside of the ocean. So we can kind of recreate that by trying to stack water on top of each other. So our fresh water is going to be the one floating on top, and our salt water is going to be the one sitting towards the bottom because it's more dense, more heavy, and so it's going to sit lower, and our fresh water should be able to stack on top. So we're going to try and add 2 samples of water here into our test tube, and we're going to see if we can get one to sit on top of the other. So in order for us to kind of tell the difference between the two, I'm going to change the color of one of them. So I'll change the color of our saltwater sample here. Add a little food coloring in there, and I'll mix it up real quick, and then we will start our experiment. So what we're going to be doing this in, as I mentioned a second ago, is these test tubes here. So our test tubes are long little tubes here that we can use to help give us separation in samples so we can do different tests. That's why test tubes is a pretty good name for them, right? The other tool we're going to be using to do this today is a pipette. So this is just basically a dropper that helps me do helps me to add in my samples with precision, so it's not getting all over the place. So it's a very commonly used tool in science. But if you wanted to try and recreate this experiment at your house, you can definitely still do it. So if you don't have these tools, you can just use a cup and you can just pour very carefully. But using this test tube and this pipette makes it a little easier for me. But yeah, so this is definitely something you can do at home, just using cups and different water samples of different salinities. You can stack a couple of them together if you'd like. You can do up to 5 if you wanted. Another thing that you can change about the samples is the temperature. So usually our colder water would sink down to the bottom, whereas our warmer water would kind of go towards the top. So if you wanted to try and do different salinities as well as different temperatures and see how many layers you can get, that can be an experiment you can do as well. So now that my saltwater sample here is nice and purple, we're going to go ahead and try and do our stacking. So in order to do this, you are going to add in your saltwater sample first, because like I said, that's the one going to be sitting on the bottom. My color is not very dark here, so I might end up adding a little bit more color so you can see the change between the two easier. So if you want, you can make yours pretty dark. So in order to do this, you need to add it very carefully and very slowly. Alright, so as you can see, I've got my purple water down at the bottom and my clear fresh water up at the top. So as you can see, they layer together pretty nicely. And so you have your more dense salt water on the bottom and your less dense fresh water floating on top. Alright guys, So if you want to try this at home, feel free to do so. If you want to send in some pictures of any cool striations that you get, that'd be awesome as well. If you have any questions, feel free to ask. I will be doing another video coming up soon, hopefully talking about some sea creatures. So if you're interested in those, you can check that video out coming up soon. But yeah, can't wait to see you guys when we open back up, and I hope everyone's staying safe and staying healthy, and be nice to each other and take care of yourself. Bye!